All right, well, welcome back, everyone. So now we're going to move on to our final speaker of our opening plenary session. So our speaker is going to be Dr. Frank Lake. Dr. Lake currently works for the Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station Fire and Fuels Program on tribal and community forestry and related natural resource issues. His research focuses on restoration ecology and the incorporation of indigenous knowledge into landscape restoration strategies. So Frank is going to discuss opportunities for landscape restoration from indigenous perspectives and tribal partnerships. So welcome, Frank, and whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak with you all today and present some of my research and work. And I wanted to start off by acknowledging I'm presenting from Arcata, California, in Humboldt County, in the traditional territory of the Wiyot people. I'm a Karuk descendant with Yurok half siblings, which is a tribe just to the north of here, Northern California, from where my current research lab is at. And a lot of my work is reflective of my cultural upbringing and influences from the tribes of Northwestern California, as well as some of my work and time with tribes in the Pacific Northwest, particularly those of Oregon. I spent a bit of time both as a fisheries habitat biologist on the Siuslaw National Forest and in the Rogue Siskiyou, and then later for my graduate work at Oregon State University. And I appreciate the knowledge and investment and the trust that tribes have placed in me and my other colleagues that work with tribes for making this presentation possible and sharing my work. I'm going to turn off my video for this bit and then be able to look at one monitor so it's easier for me. So really, for thinking about considerations and for approaches, it's the ask here was, what are the historic and current tribal uses of fire and traditional ecological knowledge related to restoration? I would like to be able to discuss and evaluate the different ways in which vulnerability to and resilience of traditional knowledge systems, cultural practices, including fire use, which I'll talk more about, and the ecosystem services derived by forest and across broader landscapes. I would like us to also consider in this approach how tribes are approaching wildfire hazard risk and climate vulnerability assessments, as well as in their adaptation planning, particularly around forest management and landscape restoration strategies. And then I'll give some examples using some of the cultural core areas and ecoregions as part of my case study approaches. But I really generally think there's a need to facilitate an understanding of the unique cultural differences among tribes living in different regions across the Pacific Northwest. So, we look at some of the various depictions. The map on the top right, we see a lot of linguistic diversity and a lot of tribal diversity across the state of Oregon, as well as the broader Pacific Northwest. And many of these tribes have attachments to various forest ecosystems, those habitats, and a variety of species used as resources in the continuation of their cultural practices from the past to the present, as well as into the future. And I guess the one take-home message overall that I would like you to be is that, tribes and tribal organizations are leading the efforts to restore landscapes, enhance these culturally valued resources that benefit both the public and tribes, and as well as assert their sovereignty to promote opportunities to revitalize and sustain their cultural traditions with fire and their ancestral lands. They're innovative with partnerships and other collaborative approaches for the work, and historical stewardship practices do have applications today. So there's various terms you might have heard: indigenous knowledge, which is a broader encompassing of traditional ecological knowledge, or a subset of that is traditional fire knowledge. And this is growing in a lot of research interest. So my colleague, Mary Huffman, who's with the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network, Nature Conservancy, she had this global synthesis, whereas traditional fire knowledge can be defined as fire-related knowledge, beliefs, practices that have shaped and been applied on specific landscapes for specific purposes by longtime inhabitants. So this is cumulative and evolving, and it is adaptive to both the fire regimes and the landscapes, particularly those forests. Other work more recently by my colleague, Michelle Steen Adams, in the Warm Springs, Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, excuse me, also looked at traditional knowledge of fire use, and there's other tribes that are doing the same thing. For some consideration of the framing of this is elements of the traditional fire knowledge and what I call indigenous fire stewardship, some of the work of my Canadian colleague, Amy Christensen, on this. And we look at, considerations of geology, topography, and soils, how that influences the vegetation or the fuel types, weather being an important element of that, linked to affecting fire behavior, Also fire operations, traditionally amongst families or villages or clan groups across their tribal territories, but also now in fire operations today for wildland fire management and stewardship. Ultimately, also considerations of this terrestrial knowledge around the fire effects or those desired fire effects, as well as understanding negative implications of fire on valued habitats and resources, and then aspects of fire governance, ranging from how tribes will manage fire and kind of that fire stewardship sovereignty across all different levels of individuals to these families and now government to government relationships with tribes. And there's a variety of other social factors. One of my ways in my work with colleagues has been kind of to think about biodiversity or biodiversity. And Paul mentioned there, thank you for that, Paul, and setting this up as far as understanding human services for fire-prone ecosystems. And that's one of the core of the tribal philosophies. Another one of those lessons learned is that fire is medicine. And it's this indigenous knowledge that guides fire stewardship within these fire-prone ecosystems for fire-dependent species. And the Karuk tribe, one of my colleagues down there, Bill Tripp, has framed this as cultural burning as a form of human services for ecosystems, as well as that other forms of tribal stewardship and horticultural practices that go along with managing fire. And it's the evolution of the cultural fire regimes that emerged from indigenous cultural adaptations, forming fire-dependent cultures through time. And many tribes have been in their ancestral territories from time immemorial, and in many cases, millennia of change through time also as well there, developing cultural fire regimes. And it's really the spatial and temporal extent of the fire use that really varied by different ecosystems and habitats that link to those fire affected resources of value. And also I will get to and talk a little bit about the extent of indigenous fire stewardship or cultural burning really did vary by different ecosystem or habitats, and particular to those resources by different tribal groups. When thinking about the indigenous fire knowledge and stewardship, recognize that different members of indigenous communities hold different types of knowledge and practice various types of cultural burning. So what is their responsibility and roles for fire use? The differences in their knowledge and stewardship practices and burning reflect roles based on, could be ceremonial or spiritual responsibilities tied to different subsistence, as well as utilitarian or domestic purposes, as well as economic and other security responsibilities and governance. So when working with diverse indigenous communities, whether it's certain tribes, some of which have also village affiliations, these groups such as clans or families, and various leaders that will support inclusivity of a fuller range of the types of knowledge systems. So when we think about cultural fire regimes differing from natural fire regimes, think about natural fire regimes as being lightly, those natural ignitions, lightning dominated or lightning influenced, but also in many cases where even there was a high frequency of lightning, there also was a bit of cultural burning that some people would say augmented or also supplemented lightning. But when we think about the cultural fire regime, what is it that a tribal culture or as a society today really wants from fire effects on the landscape? And so by that, influencing the frequency, which would be the specific application of fire for resource values and objectives, often being more frequent than natural lightning ignitions, specific to that resource and those particular habitats. The seasonality, as Paul mentioned, can differ both in the timing of burning, often different than natural lightning, and this can be inferred and informed by fire dendroecological studies and looking at the ring scar boundary. For many of the tribes, it's also linked to phenology. What is their emergence or their spring bud break, or what's going on with the breeding and mating times of some of the animals and birds. So that's also affects the kind of the appropriateness or the ethics behind the seasonality of burning by many tribes. And then with that, the specificity, what are particular ignition strategies within different habitat types or ecosystems for various species? And this gets down to some of the ignition patterns. In many cases, we think about backing fire down from across the ridges down into the draws. There was one example of a First Nations Canadian group in BC where they essentially in the springtime before bud break followed the snow line. So they were burning the valley and the lighter fuels at the earlier part of the late winter, early spring. And as it warmed up and fuels became receptive to burning, then they followed the elevational gradient upslope. And so there's different types of ignition strategies linked to those forest types and the seasonal availability or receptivity of those fuels. And then at the core of that is often the different burning practices in response to topography, fuel loading, weather, and that resource quality for those various cultural objectives. And again, this work here by my colleague, Michelle Steen Adams and the Warm Springs Fire Project kind of encapsulated this through time, this intergenerational knowledge that links culture to fire use as part of that seasonal round, and then those principles that drive that or influence it. If you were to do a pretty extensive ethnographic interview of historical documents, as well as doing oral history interviews with tribes, which is happening now for various projects, you would see there's a range of documented reasons for Indian fire use. This is just a short list, but some of the main ones were hunting, crop management, so particularly for nuts and berries, even could be root foods, maintaining that early cereal habitat for those geophytes and lilies. Pest management, reducing the pests that infect basketry materials and food resources. Range improvement linked to forage quality, often for ungulates and other game species that are hunted and utilized. Fireproofing, this is often thinking about areas around the traditional WUI, but also contemporary WUI today, reducing those fuel loadings around favored residential area and camps and travel corridors. And then also there was many areas where tribes had villages that connected their resource camp areas that went from valleys over mountains to between tribal territories, between villages. And it was the ignitions and the fire stewardship along those areas that connected resource gathering sites. That was one of those broader landscape fire effects that is often underaccounted for. Even along riparian areas, and particularly wetland management, many of the tribes in Oregon depended upon wetland species like tule, cattails. We think of even like dogbane or Indian hemp. And those areas were rejuvenated and promoted and enhanced through the use of fire in riparian areas where flooding wasn't adequate, or also between flooding events. Another key important resource for basket material, literally from cradle to grave for many tribes, was the necessity of having adequate quantity and quality basket materials for the material-based culture, for everything from hunting, fishing, gathering, and other aspects where baskets were used. The fuel wood was an important part of that that's also underaccounted for, such as wood for cooking and heating and food preservation, has a historical precedence, and reducing surface fuel loads in areas around tribal burning would be conducted, but also today is an important resource to heat and maintain food preservation practices. So when we think about current efforts and expanding opportunities, it's really about thinking of ways in which we formulate our partnerships. And so some of my lessons learned, I'll be sharing that with you, and work with different colleagues, is really, having collaborative research. And for me, it's, what's the researchable questions that are the science support needs of a tribe or a partnership working with a tribal lead? How does that inform adaptive management? And then also for our monitoring to evaluate the achievement of what we have set out in our land and resource management plans for objectives, are those goals that we have as those partnership entities. We also think about governance and the leadership, both in administration departments and operational programs that support project activities to accomplish the above and below approaches, which I'll be talking about through this presentation. And many of the ways that tribes are utilizing that now is through the government process, but also with agreements or compacts and memorandums of understandings with other non-governmental entities, such as watershed councils or bigger conservancies like a nature conservancy. And those achievements can be reflected in, enhanced lands, waters, resources, and the benefits of co-beneficiaries in our socio-ecological communities. So some of my approaches in this, and I continue to still build and work upon this, is, really thinking about what are the best methods to learn and engage tribes. So for me, it's been this approach of characterizing tribally valued forest resources and habitats. And so it's really understanding the importance of resources such as water, foods, materials, medicines, the regalia or ceremonial use species, linked to those forest habitats that perpetuate those cultural practices for a range of different ceremonial, subsistence, economic, and other interests. Identifying those climate and wildfire impacts to tribally valued forest habitats and resources is an emergent aspect of this work that links to forest condition, both historically understanding that as a baseline or a frame of reference, where we're at today, but also thinking about where those forests and the various ways that climate and wildfire will affect those forests and tribal uses or community uses into the future. And it's often that some of the differences that I see is that tribes utilize many species not emphasized in some of the Western science-based climate synthesis. And that's also understanding the diversity of why those species are important, just besides conservation ones like threatened and endangered species. And using an interdisciplinary approach to synthesize this sociocultural data as well as ecological data to identify what are those threats and stressors to these ecosystems and these cultural practices for those valued places. So there's been different approaches, and it's been interesting to see how these fit together. So when we're working across land jurisdictions to restore and enhance different habitats, again, there could be ones taken by kind of vegetation zones. It can be then be broken down into subregions. And then one of the approaches that I'm trying to learn and utilize more is the U.S. vegetation classification system that links with land fire to be able to, there's this code, the CES number. And that's one way of at least getting a greater understanding of what's a particular habitat or forest or vegetation type, and then what are the associated resources with that. Drilling down a little bit closer on this, when we think about resources, they can be defined or considered as both tangible and intangible elements of the environment, landscape areas that are both sites, objects, and also the psychological well-being or the state of mind, natural and cultural resources that are affiliated with that, or different species to perpetuate those cultural customs and practices and knowledges. And then those resources are often tied to a specific habitat or habitat type. And those could be places that support tribal ceremonial or subsistence practices. They may be biophysically defined, as we talked about in the prior slide, or they may be socially culturally defined site characteristics. But generally, these are places that support or potentially support a single or multiple resources of tribal value. And so this example from Northwest California and the Western Klamath Mountains I have in this picture shows some of the fire that came from the adjacent white oak prairie system that burned along those base of the Douglas firs. If it would have been a little bit drier in that time of burning, that fire would have come into the more mixed evergreen conifer forest type here that has the evergreen huckleberry, salal. You see the matsutake tan oak mushrooms that are part of that soil relationship. And then it also connects the huckleberry with the tan oak acorns and the madrone and other species in the back. And so this can be defined as one type of habitat, but you have different resources or different species of resources that are affected by fire at different times of the year, and also the time in which tribal members may come and access this. So you'd be getting acorns at one time of the year and huckleberries, might be hunting there in another, and then getting mushrooms in the late fall or winter. So there's different ways to think about how one habitat supports different resources and how those can be affected by fire through time. So related to that, really we think, how does resource abundance and quality change over time at a site or across the area? How can we consider different patches? And this gets at some of that historical mosaic that Paul was talking about, that are that heterogeneity that we want to think about in the future planning and in our current strategies. The spatial and temporal of resources availability. So often a metric that I've been looking at and using is time since fire by severity or since the treatment type, to think about how those resources are enhanced through times of various treatments, including fire use. And then that can help us understand how tribal resource needs can be integrated in with climate change in our landscape restoration strategies, and particularly how that indigenous knowledge informs in working with tribes, the prescriptions that then look at what were retained. Is that going to be fire adapted drought tolerant species that have high cultural values and uses? And then what we're going to be able to do through that in time to maintain the productivity of that place, as well as the ecosystem services that humans can provide to that area. So as part of my research framework, and I'll toggle a little bit back between some of the research and also some of the management, but really it's building upon the foundation of the indigenous knowledge or that tribal ecological knowledge. And that's some of that indigenous science support, linking multiple lines of evidence using various methods, explore treatment-based outcomes of traditional knowledge and those cultural practices on those valued habitats or resources, also including opportunities for fine-tuning seasonality and the prescriptions of treatments, understanding the difference between, say, fall and early spring fire use on a system. Identifying trigger points or thresholds and what are the various indicators informed by indigenous knowledge about the need of fire, or maybe when there should be longer fire frequencies in a place to maintain certain values. And then also revealing which metrics are applicable. And I'll give some examples of this, but often when talking to tribes or tribal practitioners, they're evaluating different things that are different enforcers or ecologists. And I'll give some more examples soon. And then having that traditional knowledge with Western science and Western knowledge guide the monitoring of and adaptive management for these habitats in these other places. And particularly some of the aspects of using tribal practitioners or working with tribes to evaluate cultural use quality. So some of the challenges, but opportunity really is to study forestry, fire, and climate effects, but at what scale? And how do we evaluate that? For many cases, it might be the overstory, canopy cover, or closure dynamics tied to canopy conditions and structure of those trees that are there making up the canopy. It can be related to the understory fire effects and the fire intensity that results in severity. The way you go about establishing your plots, or the way that you're going to have the sampling unit to be able to characterize those changes and effects from fire and other stewardship or treatments. And then thinking about nested within that, just not the forest, but also the trees and the shrubs, and looking at the understory diversity. And so maybe there's a way of looking at practitioner evaluation for huckleberry production or nut or seed crops. And then now using other technologies like remote sensing and LiDAR at a broader area and level, but also providing quite a bit of detail in looking at how we quantify or characterize those places at different scales. I do work on a range of interdisciplinary studies, and this is informed, and again, Paul set this up quite a bit for some of the work, and thinking about how paleoclimate fire history can inform our understanding of historical conditions that might be guides or benchmarks for today for trying to replicate. There's a lot of information within ethnographic and oral histories, as well as bringing in historical maps and photos to inform the past to the present for tribal resources use. There's a big emphasis on tribal ethnobotany, particularly baskets and traditional foods, and linking that to individual plant traits or conditions at these plots or your sampling unit. And then having a systematic approach or subjective way of really thinking about where you put those plots to characterize habitat and resource quality. And then bringing in these other forms of technology like the LiDAR. So for me, it's, bringing all these together, and also work at the tribes where we can have different ways of assessing that condition and what might be our treatment options to achieve those shared values and objectives. Another way of thinking about this is, what is the potential natural vegetation of an area? So this work from the Sierra Nevada kind of illustrates this, but think about it for Oregon forest as well, is where you have a more lightning dominated regime at the top, which gives you a range of conifers and hardwoods and different fire tolerant and intolerant species, and different types of fuel loading, as well as understory diversity in the grasses, forbs, and shrubs. The middle section represents lightning and indigenous burning that really fosters the system, both increased frequency, maybe even some diversity and seasonality, the specificity of burning to favor such things as oaks and big pines, with a lot more understory open diversity and complex early cereal, but also having patches there, some fire intolerance or regeneration. And in the bottom slide, depicting really the cessation or the removal of Indian burning and lightning suppression of fire, suppression of lightning fires, that really looks at the overdense stands, high fuel loading, loss of understory diversity, and highly vulnerable system now to both drought, disease, and fire that we're experiencing. And so how do we kind of take a system that is the current one before it burns up in uncharacteristically severe fire or beetle kill, and then try to restore some of the attributes of the former condition that we want for the future? Suggested approach, and I did publish this in some of my work on bear grass, and I'll mention that study coming up. But this occurred to me as part of the Forest Service scientists for our Western Klamath Restoration Partnership. Is I heard practitioners or tribal members talking about one thing of importance, or the foresters and ecologists talking about another. And so if we just kind of think about the way I broke this down on this table, across the left column, I have those forestry and fire kind of things of interest. And so it could be plant understory diversity, tree diameter sizes, fuel loading, how we go about that. And another one, like on the bottom left corner there, the canopy cover or closure. And then within that, for an ecologist or forester, we have, different variables or metrics in that second column going down through the rows. And so for things like the second row, we'll have tree diameter, diameter breast height, you might measure that, basal area, we might have a site productivity index to kind of characterize that. But the cultural values are characteristics that are desired are larger full crown, structurally diverse trees and fewer trees per acre. And they're variable. There's also another one that we can align with, would be having older mature forest with favored tree species. And then our treatment and restoration strategy on that far right column would be thinning different types of trees and use of the wildland fire, both prescribed fire or managing wildfire for resource objectives. And then I'll go all the way down to the bottom one, looking at that canopy cover and closure. We have different ways of measuring that at the plots. And the cultural value would be the amount of light, filtered or partial sunlight, that affects fruiting and understory plant diversity, used for foods, medicines, and materials. It's going to be also the quality and quantity of fruit or the light affecting that plant and the production of those valued resources, but we can have a range of manual chainsaw thinning, mechanical silvicultural harvesting, and different types of trees or single tree treatments that really favor and promote that, looking at, again, that variable of canopy cover or closure, just as a way of thinking about framing and talking about what are similar interests. And so thinking about an approach for this is building upon an example done with my colleague Jonathan Long and others in the Sierra Nevada tribes, is really looking at oak restoration to identify former orchards and helping restore those for acorn food as a nutritional food, but also acorns being an important element for wildlife and for the food webs. And so really part of this was to consider how we evaluate whether tribal resources are available in a desired quantity and quality. And through that, we identified and tried to understand what were some of those common metrics and indicators. And what we found is there was initially a perception of conflict between maintaining open oak orchards and restoring full crown oaks and early cereal habitat with more pines and cedars in these meadow complexes, to that of endangered species that really wanted to favor spotted owl habitat. And what we saw when we were out there with elders and foresters and ecologists and wildlife biologists and other scientists and line officers or managers on the local unit there at that national forest, was that you can have on the south facing aspect, lower slope position in that watershed, the big full crown oaks in that early cereal habitat is depicted on the right, desired conditions for acorn gathering. And just around on the north aspect, across that ridge system, that might be your fuel management line or a fire line system in there. You could have in the lower part of that riparian area, north aspect, you could have this more close multi-structured forest type that would be more preferred for that critical habitat for the spotted owl or for the fisher. And so once we kind of identified these areas, that helped us then map out a strategy for the heterogeneity, where we can look at the same species or mixed conifer forest type of looking at black oaks, but then thinking about where that could be promoted to achieve different values and interest. Another similar example maybe to consider for basketry, and this is for like the Western Oregon tribes and for others, but it can be applied to other basketry stems, is really thinking about what does the ethnographic or the oral history information say about the season of burn. And in this case, this study with my colleague Tony Marks Blocks, we looked at various treatments across seasons and light conditions that fostered the elongation or the production of shoots like hazel to use for baskets. And then we found that more close forest often would produce longer shoots that were used for basket. And if you had the hazel bush associated more with the Oregon white oak or more open oak habitat and prairies, you could also produce some basketry shoots, but also it was more light, produce nuts, a traditional food resource. And then that top picture on the left shows hazel sticks with hazelnuts in the basket on one of those hazel shrubs. Another example that was used in getting the involvement of cultural practitioner basket weavers from Northern California up to Washington was this idea of taking the basket weavers out and asking them, what is your habitat evaluation of this being good, marginal, or poor? And then when them identifying that, particularly for the forest stand conditions for tree loading, down fuel loads, and then also the bear grass density and quality visually, like the color of or the feel of the bear grass for cultural uses, we kind of had this scaled approach. And so by asking the basket weavers, again, what was your good, marginal, or poor habitat? We then randomly selected plots within that and then measured those. And what we found in this regard was areas that were considered better gathering or of higher quality for bear grass harvesting site generally had fewer trees per acre and the basal area was lower. And then when we looked at the fuel loading across these sites, we found that basically when you had fewer fuels, you could have some big heavies like logs, but if you didn't have all the limbs and all the sticks and all the high surface litter, that generally was a good habitat. And if it was too thick and dense with a higher tons of per acre fuel loading, it made it poor, just because it was also harder to get through that. And you see this example of a poor stand on the upper left. And then also there might be the bear grass density. And then generally the conditions of light and fuel loading also affected the bear grass quality. So using kind of and scaling up, now I'm working with Paul and others to really look at how we do reburn simulations that not only model historical ignition patterns by lightning, but also emulating and working with indigenous knowledge through tribes to apply what are those culturally specified areas of fire use and how we model that out. Other aspects of that, and I do serve as a resource advisor on fires, often working with the heritage consultants at tribes and archaeologists from agencies, is thinking about our potential fire management scenarios and options in the future. And so bringing this together, we really have an integration of indigenous and Western science knowledge for our wildland fire research, but also directly linking to how we manage wildfires now and into the future. Looking at and considering some examples here, really for looking at how various tribes are developing their climate plans and linking that particularly to understanding historical fire in a way that may be utilizing and revitalizing cultural fire stewardship pertains to just not areas along these valleys, but across different forest types and going up to the higher, basically from the lowlands up to the higher subalpine or alpine environments. And so this example from the Karuk climate plan really shows this kind of intersection, and other tribes are doing this as well. So when we think about putting this, what is kind of the context now? So we've kind of have a historical understanding. We're getting a better idea of what tribes do think about and would consider the framing or the classification of their valued habitat and those resources or species that make up those resources. Let's put it within this landscape restoration strategy. So we think about our heterogeneity and resilience considerations. We are looking at the areas that we can have the greatest agreement and have these strategically placed landscape area treatments and being able to treat a smaller part of the landscape for pooling our resources and our capacity to treat that will affect not only how we manage wildfire now, but into the future, and thinking about where we have the most agreement on that, linking that with the climate vulnerability assessments and adaptation planning efforts, particularly from the tribal perspective, identifying those threats and stressors to the environment and those community practices, and then thinking about those considerations of cultural ecosystem services. And I really think this is another one that tribes are really promoting, is that the revival of tribal stewardship can be those human services for those ecosystems that increase their resistance and resilience. And then putting this in the context of national strategies like the National Cohesive Strategy for Wildland Fire Management, we have those three tenets of resilient landscapes, fire adapted communities, so being prepared for wildfire, but also being able to respond to it. And so thinking about tribes as fire dependent cultures, and then also for wildland fire management responses. And then these approaches, then linking those to those tribal and rural community values to achieve multiple objectives and for the reintroduction of fire. And then how that also, again, what are we measuring and how are we measuring that to evaluate the success or the achievement of what we want to have across our landscapes. So the example here from Northwest California, and I'll give some other examples from Oregon, but really for me, it was like a lot of historical mapping of where the villages were at, the trail network systems that radiate across from villages to different resource collection places, from the river corridors to the backcountry. And then thinking about that same area of interest now as a contemporary, our Indian villages, but now towns of our communities, the wildland interface is where do we have the greatest alignment? And so with the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership, they look at those values overlay, and those overlaying the values essentially showed us where we're going to have the most agreement, where we should focus on doing those treatments that are going to have the greatest, hopefully, success in that. And so far, those projects are beginning to be implemented. Other approaches from tribes, such as here as a Klamath tribe and in Southern Oregon, is really to think about, what was the historical structure and composition of those forests in that area, and then what are the ways in which the tribe, through a forest management plan, can then take this historical data and think about their prescriptions and treatments today. I would also say that it's conformed from other forms of knowledge, such as the fire histories. And we look at this picture here from Edward Curtis of this Klamath Indian, probably just south of the Crater Lake area. That pine has a fire cavity there and has fire scars. And so that's one way of inferring what the fire history was and seasonality and frequency, but it's also the Indians that were using that place historically and have that intergenerational knowledge and look to those same places within that forest today to perpetuate cultural customs as well as the livelihoods. And then thinking about, working forest and promoting tribal cultures as well as the security of the rural communities that they're a part of. This often focuses again on, where do we start? The protection of life and property and resources from undesired wildfires, thinking about sociocultural well-being and local economies. Many tribes focus on food security and cultural practices and increasing access and an opportunity for harvesting, bringing in a variety of treatments that are informed by indigenous knowledge and also contemporary Western science considerations that are informed by the science. So we think about our manual and mechanical treatments. And again, are we promoting drought tolerant, fire adapted species that are more resistant or more resilient? And do those have a higher cultural use quality or value? Thinking about the pile, patch, and broadcast burning of treatments and the type of fire that in many ways is permitted, or also you have the authorization to use. And then many of us talk about, or people do talk about, managing wildfires for resource benefits. Well, we see sometimes that there's often a suppression mandate to protect life, property, and resources, or for firefighter safety. And we also have to think about the trade-offs in the way that we manage fire, in particular the types of fires that we're starting to experience. And in some cases, there's fire suppression where desired or required. And that can also relate to no treatment, such as protected areas or having longer fire return intervals in areas that might have been frequent. And that can be for a range of different objectives or reasons. An example of this work that was taken by Monique Weinkoop and colleagues on the Coville National Forest and those adjacent tribal lands around there was to look at, what are the cultural perceptions or cultural interest and perspectives around, fire. And so getting back to fire, exploring a multidisciplinary approach to this. And in that regard, it was looking at here, the graph on the left, it's kind of hard to see, but the top left column with those graphs showed mechanical thinning, and then a range of benefit, damaging, or depends. And so that was part of that evaluation. And then it related to what kinds of treatments, such as less roads or combined with fire treatments, remove commercial tree species selection, having less treatments, using natural fire might be best, removing slash or understory fuels, and in some cases, no recommendation. And so she and her colleagues essentially looked at what is a tribal perspective related to cultural use plants of importance for the different mechanical thinning. The prescribed burning is shown in the middle, and then the wildfires on those circular graphs on the right. So when we think about, innovation and approaches, really tribes are leading the way. And I don't know how much, even for myself as a research scientist and working primarily here in Northern California and more of the Western Pacific Northwest area, is that, many tribes have their land and resource management plans or forest and climate plans that reflect both Western and Indigenous knowledge applications. Demonstrated within this work is a range of values and interests that are reflected in how those management approaches are taken. And then there's also many of these ones are also going being updated. So we have, like, for the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management, we have the Northwest Forest Plan. Other places, there's going to be forest plans that are going to be revised across different entities. And those now are going to be more broadly, and rightfully so. And Jessica touched on this and provided some great information for y'all to consider is, how do we put that in the nexus of climate change, how that links to forest conditions, and then the community well-being or security. That's also linked with some of those risk assessments and other considerations. Just to talk about and kind of come back to this point, at least tribes here in Northern California are really doing this at the government-to-government level by utilizing these compacts, agreements, and other memorandums of understandings. You have more direct consultation and coordination with tribes on this. And often it's just more than the maintenance of cultural and heritage resources. It's about the vitality and living community opportunities for tribes today and the community they live with to the other members of the public. What do we have at risk? I often like to use this slide. And again, I'm sorry I don't have any Oregon or Eastern Oregon examples, but we think about nature as teacher. And this is another one of those tribal philosophies and perspectives is that, we see unique species that have this structural component, and like this big oak, Canyon live oak on the right for me, there's no way that tree would have grown to that large, full open capacity as I have my hand there and looking at it. And then that branch in the center lower left, you can climb on that branch and then climb up would be about 10 or 15 feet above me in that tree. That was frequent cultural burning around there. If we waited for a lightning mediated regime, that tree probably would have had a different architecture because of the fuel loading and the scorch height. But this area is now highly vulnerable. You can see densification of it. Any fire coming from down below the river canyon and up to that, this would be lost in high severity fire. In other cases, like the big oak in the middle, the densification and the shading out, the lower limbs have reduced the whole lower 1/3 of that canopy area and producing acorns, as well as this being with that traditional food orchard there being really changed in conditions. So how do we restore that place, but also think about the vulnerability of those big legacy trees to inform us and still get that structural component and functionality back. And then on the lower left, you see an old gnarly manzanita that's been over toppled and shaded out. And it used to be an open ridge system that had sugar pine and ponderosa pine, beargrass understory forbs, and open crown manzanita that had surface fires applied to it along that historical tribal trail. and also was used as a food processing area. And so again, as these areas have type converted, now have excessive fuel loading, are high at risk, particularly to fires in the upper slope, third slope position. If all of these burn up, we lose that ability to learn from that. And that's one of the tragedies also tribes are trying to convey. It's just not only the loss of the physical cultural artifacts and resources, but also the ecological legacy that's depicted through the structure and the associations at some of these sites that inform us how to live with fire. And so, part of these challenges is we're thinking about how was fire used historically and how is fire going to be used today. And so this work done by Carol and others really showed, what is the area for tribal lands, allotments around the house, our cultural, who was using fire then and now, where do they really see opportunities to utilize fire, and then what and why are the reasons. And so, and if it was tied to historical purposes, then what's the historical consideration that puts this use of fire in a modern application to achieve our objectives. And so there's various ways that you can look to the literature for this, and I would encourage that, because then it really does values, although tribes are similar, there may be some very unique differences in uses and values for tribes that are particular to their own area or cultural practices. And so then here, just in a few minutes, just want to kind of end on this aspect of, decolonizing wildland fire management and forestry. What could it be? And so there's often been these academic descriptions of what that process is, but really for many tribes, it's, recognizing the effects of colonization on indigenous lands and territories, the impacts of their cultures, knowledge systems, and fire-prone ecosystems. And it's that erasure of the indigenous fire sovereignty and their cultural uses of fire. Many tribes in the Northwest, particularly in Oregon, have retained rights across ceded territories for hunting, gathering, and fishing. But if fire was one of those main cultural practices, use that. The tribes also retain the right to use fire in their usual and accustomed places if it promotes those very resources for hunting and gathering, and also related to fisheries. We also think about, the historical factors. And in many cases, I see colleagues or academic scientists who want to say, oh, I want to learn from tribes and then incorporate their traditional ecological knowledge. But we have to also say the factors that have also decreased the availability of that knowledge. And so what does it take for tribes who often were considered to be arsonists for perpetuating cultural practices and burning in the early 1900s that are now considered maybe one of the ones that we want to have for burn bosses? And, how was fire at one point in the perspective of that tribe considered cultural burning at one time as arsonist or incinerism that now is looking to be as a system of value? How does that affect intergenerational trauma, or how does it affect the perspective of tribes who want to come forth and share their knowledge and in a way that they feel that they can be trusted and also have that opportunity to work with it? And so we just have to think about the changing conditions that affect tribes. What could this be? It can be forms of governance where we're supporting indigenous sovereignty and decision-making authority through these partnerships. It can be that administration or jurisdictional approaches for co-leadership and decision-making and the management of their ancestral territories or ceded lands. It can be the fiscal or budgetary, having the appropriations and allocations to support indigenous fire stewardship and tribal engagement. It's planning across jurisdictions in the prioritization and the strategies for the types of management and the research that can be conducted, just not on reservations, but across those ancestral territories of tribes. And then operationally, thinking about the implementation of different programs and projects that have that indigenous engagement and what that looks like and facilitating that. And for many tribes, I've heard this, it's an important aspect of the reconciliation, repatriation, and restoration. So the recovery of those burning practices, those fire adapted ecosystems and species, and those cultural fire regimes that to support their fire dependent cultures for tribes, we have to understand where we've been in the past, where we're at, and then for them the revitalization of culture moving into the future. And then so for some of these things, we have barriers, but we also have solutions for consideration. So again, I talked about some of the governance aspects on that, looking at policy revision and some of the legal implications for retained or legally recognized rights, utilizing those authorities and jurisdictional considerations, thinking about that administrative part to see changes on the ground. And then the big one for tribes and then for many rural communities is that workforce capacity. So the recruitment and retention of tribal community members to do the work, how that education and training both looks at the integration of Western and traditional knowledge systems that inform treatment prescriptions, and even how the treatments and when and where they'll be conducted. And then looking at that labor workforce and who does the work. And so those are all really big things now that tribes, from their perspective, I'm learning as a scientist and also my tribal community of importance. So in ending here on this last part, really thinking about creating that best available science, To inform management, having those tribes and tribal organizations as our research partners. What are the researchable questions and science support needs? Develop and implement those national to regional initiatives or programs. Having tribal input and participation and oversight with like the full research process or the full management process. Even when we think about NEPA or other parts of doing the environmental analysis, having tribes engage with that with interdisciplinary teams, as well as consultation and coordination. And then assisting with the creation of best available science to form policy, and then going into those management plans or those prescriptions. And ultimately, I think all of us want to have respectful knowledge sharing, and learning together and working together to improve the conditions of our landscape and our environment for living, working forest. And just to kind of get ready to my closing remarks and my last bit of questions here, I have this forthcoming report that featured Michelle and some of her work with Warm Springs, but also working with others here is best practices for partnering with American Indians and Alaska Natives in research and management. This GTR, General Technical Report, will be coming out probably next fall, and it looks at wildland fire, forestry, and climate-related research and management. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Frank. That was an excellent presentation, a lot of great information. I want to open it up for questions now. So if anybody has any questions, please put them in the Q&A box.
And could you field those for me? So I don't see anything in the question and answer from where I'm at.
Yeah, I will.
Great. I don't know how much you've been in the chat there.
Does anybody have any questions for Frank?
You let me off easy today.
Apparently. When is that best practices publication going to be available?
We're hoping this fall. So it's going through the P&W printing and review process, and Michelle is going to be wrapping up the last few bit of kind of like print ready or whatever, you know, last bit of formatting and things that we need to do on that document. So probably this fall, I'm hoping.
One question popped up here and asked if you were available for follow-up questions after they could digest the information that you shared.
Yes.
We'll make your email available. It should be, no, it's not. We'll have your email available so folks can follow.
Okay, I can change back to one of those slides that had on my entry slide if that was the.
All right, we had a couple questions pop up here. I should let you get that slide pulled up first.
Yeah, anyways, there we go. There's my middle line there.
Okay, so first one here is, what are some barriers to integrating Indigenous values and Native land managers with government management and jurisdiction that you see in your work?
I think some of the barriers, and this is a big one, it's kind of tough to unpack, is acknowledging really the legacy of a different management regime. So, you know, the fire exclusion policy and fire suppression policies have now created overdense stands, high vulnerability, and an approach to trying to manage wildfire that doesn't take over our communities and really end up in high severity impacts that we don't want to see. But then having people understand that the tribes really are also, I don't say victims is the wrong word, but, you know, really have had to respond to that. And what I see today now, because of the longer fire seasons, tribes have traditional burning times like the fall. But when they want to do their prescribed burning, those resources for holding capacity in their partners like the Forest Service isn't available because they're all off suppressing fires someplace else. And then now in order to get air quality approval, often limited operating periods, and then because being out of the fire season, there's a big emphasis to do more late spring, early summer burning before the start of the fire season. And that often is at differences with tribes' perspectives about utilizing fire that would otherwise impact those phenologically vulnerable shrubs and trees, that maybe that scorch would hurt them and have negative effects. particularly also affecting breeding and mating wildlife. And so I see tribes now having to compromise their traditional values and ethics in order to get some fire, or because of the bigger institutional support is linked into this. Jonathan Long and I wrote this socio-ecological traps paper, but there's a system now where we're responding to the effect, but it's not the solution that would necessarily be promoted or desired by the tribe. And we're asking the tribes to compromise yet one more time. Well, if we really want to reduce fuel loads and protect private property and communities, we should be doing prescribed burning in this like late spring. Well, the tribe is then kind of seen as pitted against the fuels reduction objective when resources are available for fire personnel versus when they would have other burned at a different time of year. And those are some of the greatest challenges I see now, is overcoming that, but understanding at one scale bigger, why are we addressing this problem this way, and kind of looking at the tribes as the one as the barrier, rather than looking at the condition that's been here as a product of governmental fire exclusion and suppression and the condition of the fuels out there on the landscape now. And then when we really have the resources available to respond to that.
Okay, we have another question here. What is your experience working with the Tribal Forest Protection Act, and how might it assist with our restoration goals?
I'm a research scientist, but there's a few tribes that have used the Tribal Forest Protection Act. There's also the Reserve Treaty Lands, RTRL, Reserve Rights Treaty Lands funding through Bureau of Indian Affairs, that are looking at promoting more fuels treatments and fire management. And so I'll reference those two. I know Mark Jackson, who's with BIA, NIFC, is also looking at opportunities to tie in with BIA and tribes on doing more active fuels and fire management. And that's something that the tribes, at least in California, could do. But I know some tribes in Oregon and Washington have also utilized that funding. Sorry, I don't know much specifically about that for the Oregon area. I should have looked into it.
I have two questions here that are kind of similar. So for those of us working on public land restoration, where in the tribal hierarchy do you recommend we start building Western tribal partnerships? Do we start with government to government relationships, or colleagues in tribal natural resource departments?
I think it would probably start, really effectively at the natural resources department, and then seeing, at that level, kind of at the project or for the plan development or what you're doing, and then having the tribe engage at that level. You'll see where the resource and staff needs are, and then from that they can take that to their tribal councils and then get that government to government to support that effort. Sometimes just sending a letter, like a scoping letter to tribal council. And with the turnover of tribal council members, our chairperson, it's better to, I'd say, more effective in some ways to send that government to government level as you're required for consultation or for outreach, but also then make the point to follow up with phone calls and emails and other ways. We're done with COVID. Hopefully, we're a little bit past that, more in-person opportunities to find out those natural resource departments or forestry program staff and leadership.
We have another question here. How much variability is there between tribes for processes to determine tribal cultural values? And then what are those processes? And then how much variability is there across the Western United States?
There's actually quite a bit of variability, and it's even challenging for me as a scientist to kind of frame it in, what is a tribal perspective, or what are those values? And, there's been various approaches. And so one, you can look at it, just what are values broadly, and then trying to tie those values to a specific discipline area like forestry or fire or traditional foods or basket material. And then even going down to that finer level of then, well, what is the particular value, say, tied to a first foods or traditional foods? Like it might be camas. Well, the value for that might be something as a traditional food, but also as a way of perpetuating cultural knowledge system. And then the value of that cultural practice is tied into like swale or meadow restoration that would promote camas meadows, and a forest around it. So those are, for me, it's kind of a categorization approach, and then drawing under various umbrellas, which ones fall under that, and then the next sub area, and then down to some of the specifics. And then even for tribes, like on the bear grass one, more of the tribes in Southern Oregon and Northern California prefer to have bear grass that's burned because of its pliability in the use of baskets, where I was finding some of the tribes farther north that do imprecation or different type of basket weaving with the bear grass didn't necessarily need to have the basket or the bare grass material that they're burned and had the young supple leaves. It was more about the type of leaf that they got and what part of the world on that. So really for me, even looking at something like bare grass as an important basketry resource, it's used in different types of baskets between different tribes that have different weaving technology, culture, and cultural ways of weaving, and even down to where that bare grass is found and what kind of forest type. So that, this is other ways that I really kind of break that down and get more specific. And within that, it also does show the range of diversity.
Another question here. I've read that the Amazon shows evidence of pre-colonial management to create a forest with food-producing trees. You noted oak orchards, but I wonder if there is any evidence of active planting of trees for food in the Western United States.
Planted or fostered, it's tough. Like that big oak I showed, the Canyon live oak isn't necessarily a high acorn food species for tribal subsistence, but it is for the wildlife. Was that tree planted there, or was it a young one that then was nurtured, and then through time of careful fire use and stewardship around there, it grew that wide open crown, and then that tree serves as a different landscape marker. I think in this diagram here of this artwork depicting the kind of plateau cultural, Columbia Plateau culture, were individual ponderosa pines planted? Maybe not. Were they definitely facilitated and fostered through time to be on the edge of a meadow? So then that way you had them maybe in an area that was conducive to growing a certain size to get the black lichen that then would be cooked with the camas in the pit ovens. And then, the other things like maybe the different aspect over there with the Douglas fir or the larch and things like that. I really think in some cases, tribes, a long way of saying this, in some cases, tribes have creation accounts or stories that acknowledge long time trees being in a place. But we know trees, could be hundreds of years old, whereas a tribe might have been living there for thousands of years. And so I think it's really the promotion of the habitat, but then there also has been examples, and I'm going to say for camas, where many tribes, women would marry into a different cultural group, and men would marry women from another area. And it was at least an ethnographic information and some things I've heard in oral history that those women would bring with them their varieties of camas or other things as they moved to their husband's traditional territory or village area. And there could be the outplanting of that. And so I think maybe we have to re-question along the lines of this, how many areas in a more complex tribal agroforestry system were nurtured or facilitated, and in many cases, in a few examples in California, you actually have shown where there's genetic variants over a long time with geophytes that were promoted through cross-reference with archaeological information that only have developed over the last several thousand years or even longer, 6,000 years, that were culturally nurtured, and that led to a different subspecies. So it's a gradient there.
All right, well, thank you, Frank. We are out of time. Really appreciate you sharing with us today. So that is going to conclude our opening plenary session. So up next, we are going to have lunch, but before that, we are going to do another raffle. So,
well, thank you again too as I close out.
Sounds good. So John, if you want to share the raffle slide. There we go. All right, again, we have another grocery bag and pen, and our winner for this raffle is Julian Uchiha. Sorry if I mispronounced that, but we'll get in contact with you after the meeting and get this sent out to you. So with that, we are going to break for lunch. Please be back here at 1 p.m. It's going to be in this same meeting. So if you close it, it's going to be the same link to be back in this same webinar. Over lunch, if you get a chance, go check out the virtual silent auction. We have a lot of great items donated by members across the state. Bid on those. And the other announcement I wanted to make is there are CFE credits available for this meeting. I'll make another announcement before the end of the day. But please see the program or the meeting website to download that form. And you'll need to fill out your name, email address, CF number, and then I will provide a keyword at the end of the day as well for CFE credits. But let me know if you have any questions, and I will see everyone back here at 1 p.m.